Refusing accountability for the torture and other abuses committed in the name of counterterrorism doesn't just corrode America's legal system. It's hurting our allies as well. Now, the UK is moving to expand the use of controversial secret hearings in national security cases to help keep a lid on torture committed at the hands of the Americans. And the use of British intelligence in covert U.S. drone strikes in Pakistan is the subject of a new lawsuit by the civilian victims of those attacks. But don't expect any of that to be on the public agenda of today's meetings between President Obama and the British Prime Minister. David Cameron is in town for a 3-day visit to reaffirm the so-called special relationship between the two countries. This apparently entails watching a basketball game with the president, eating hot dogs, and later this evening, a glitzy state dinner reception. Now, I would love to tell you what's on the menu, but guess what? That information is apparently secret, too. David Cameron may be sipping on some expensive Chardonnay this evening, but no need to rub that in the face of struggling Americans amid a recession, because the price list for that is deemed secret. But let's talk a little bit more about the special relationship between the two countries. For that, I'm joined by investigative journalist and the author of the book Guantanamo Files, Andy Worthington, right across the pond in London. Andy, welcome back to the program. What is your assessment of this special relationship between the U.S. and the U.K.? Do they really need to prove to the world and to each other that these two leaders are friends and working lock and step, or have the country's policies proven that already?
I think it's strange, really. I mean, ever since 9/11 and the war on terror began, first of all, we had a Labour Prime Minister cozying up with a Republican president. Now we've got a Democratic president cozying up with a Conservative Prime Minister. It doesn't seem to make much difference. Maybe all it demonstrates is how interchangeable these people have become. Certainly there are, pretty terrible reasons for Obama and Cameron to be close buddies. They're both deeply involved in this horrible war that has gone on longer than any war that anyone can remember. That should have ended long ago. They're also, they were, the countries at least were hand in hand, shoulder to shoulder with each other in countering terrorism and the involvement in torture and rendition in the darkest days of the war on terror. And as I think you were hearing from my colleague Jason just before, of course, the Obama administration has not wanted to open up about what took place in those years. And the Cameron administration here, having initially appeared to favor transparency, has now clammed up as well.
And I want to talk sort of about how folks in the UK see this. I mean, do they see their own government as complicit in sort of this growing escalation in secrecy and in clampdowns on the access of information, or do they see this as evidence of the UK, for example, being beholden perhaps to the US somehow?
Well, I would hope that in terms of accountability, people in this country are aware that we have demonstrably examples of an independent judiciary that actually exposed the complicity in torture of the previous Labour government. And that, that people will see that the attempts by the Cameron-led government to impose greater secrecy across the board in British courts is a dangerous obstacle to truth-seeking and accountability, and that I hope that the British people are sufficiently aware of the importance of keeping a check on our elected leaders, and that will be combated, and I hope so. I mean, we have certainly, enough of an independent media probing these issues for it to be something that I think people will be concerned about.
Well, you may have sorry to interrupt, you may have an independent media, but there's one case, it's not a torture case by any means, it's a copyright case, but Richard O'Dwyer, who is a young kid, a UK citizen, who was in violation of US copyright laws and is now being extradited to the U.S. by the UK for violating those copyright laws. We're looking at photos of him right now. I mean, it would seem, based on your independent press over in the UK, that this kind of thing is an outrage.
Well, I think people are very concerned about various issues to do with the extradition treaty, and I'm very glad that you asked me about that, because we believe that to some extent this may take part in some kind of discussions between the two leaders, although I can't see that it will be given much precedence by either of them. But the extradition treaty that the UK has with the US is, you know, this terrible one-sided affair whereby nothing really needs to be put forward in the way of evidence for the British to have to hand people over for prosecution in the United States. And what keeps happening over and over again, and the fundamental problem is that if these are people who have committed some kind of crime in the country where they are, then those things should be dealt with there. The extradition treaty just seems over and over is actually removing people unnecessarily and dangerously, I think, from the place where they actually should be dealt with. And I mean, it's not just the case of this young man that you're talking about, although of course that's very, very relevant just now. But we have other issues like Baba Ahmed, for example, who's a young man who has spent 8 years in a British jail without charge or trial, pending his intended extradition to the United States. You know, these are terrible issues. But as I say, I'm not convinced they're going to be discussed much. The same as I'm not convinced at all that David Cameron will raise the issue of Shaka Armour, who is the last British resident in Guantanamo, who neither the US government wants to hold, you know, and the British government wants him back. He's been 5 years this has been going on. The US doesn't want him, the British wants him back. Why is he still held? But apparently when these guys meet, they never discuss it. So I wouldn't imagine that some of these, you know, rather terrible instances of people's lives being ruined unnecessarily are going to be the kind of things that are on the agenda while they're busy watching sporting matches and having a slap-up dinner.
Well, Andy, unfortunately, we're out of time, but even if they were on the agenda, it looks like we probably won't know about it because of those wonderful secrecy laws here in the U.S. Thank you so much, Andy Worthington, the author of Guantanamo Files.